Imagine waking up tomorrow to find that your paycheck is worth half what it was yesterday. Your mortgage payment doubles. Gas prices skyrocket. And the grocery store is nearly empty because nobody wants to accept dollars for food. Sound like a nightmare? This could become reality if the US dollar loses its status as the world's reserve currency. Right now, in 2025, we are closer to this scenario than most people realize. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen to around 57%, the lowest level in 30 years. China is stockpiling gold. BRICS nations are exploring alternatives. And the electric vehicle revolution is threatening to dismantle the petrodollar system that has kept the dollar on top since the 1970s. So what would actually happen if the dollar lost its throne? Let's explore this economic doomsday scenario. First, let's understand what we're dealing with. The US dollar has been the world's dominant reserve currency since World War II. About 58% of all foreign currency reserves held by central banks worldwide are in US dollars. When countries trade with each other, they typically use dollars. When oil is sold, it's priced in dollars. When investors look for safety, they buy dollar-denominated assets. This privileged position gives America enormous economic advantages. The U.S. can borrow money at much lower interest rates than other countries because there's constant global demand for dollars and dollar-denominated assets like treasury bonds. America can run large trade deficits without immediate consequences because other countries need dollars to function in the global economy. But this dominance is slipping. Since 2000, the dollar's share of global reserves has dropped from over 70% to around 57% today. Central banks are diversifying into other currencies and gold. The most striking trend? They're not just moving to the euro, which still hovers around 20%. They're shifting into what economists call non-traditional reserve currencies, like the Australian dollar, Canadian dollar, and even the Chinese yuan. Now let's imagine what happens if this trend accelerates dramatically and the dollar loses its reserve currency status entirely. The first thing that would happen is a massive currency crisis. As countries rush to diversify out of dollars, they would start selling their holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds and other dollar-denominated assets. We're talking about trillions of dollars flooding the market simultaneously. The dollar's value would plummet. Your purchasing power for imported goods would collapse overnight. That iPhone made in China? It might cost $2,000 instead of $1,000. The coffee from Colombia, the electronics from Japan, the clothes from Bangladesh, all would become exponentially more expensive as the dollar weakens. Interest rates would skyrocket. Without global demand for U.S. Treasury bonds, the federal government would need to offer much higher interest rates to attract buyers. This means higher borrowing costs for everyone. Your mortgage rate could jump from 7% to 15% or higher. Credit card rates, already high, could become predatory. Car loans, business loans, student loans, all would become crushing burdens. The stock market would likely crash. As foreign investors pull money out of U.S. equities and the cost of borrowing explodes, stock prices would tumble. Retirement accounts would evaporate. The wealth effect would disappear as people watch their net worth crater. One of the most devastating consequences would be the collapse of the petrodollar system. Since 1974, when the U.S. made a deal with Saudi Arabia, oil has been priced and traded primarily in dollars. This created artificial global demand for the currency. If you wanted to buy oil, you needed dollars first. If this system unravels, energy prices in America would become incredibly volatile and generally much higher. Currently, when oil prices rise globally, the strong dollar acts as a buffer for American consumers. But with a weak dollar, you'd feel the full impact of every price swing. A barrel of oil at $80 might cost Americans what $150 feels like today. This matters more than just gas prices. Oil and petroleum products are fundamental to modern life. Plastics, fertilizers, transportation, manufacturing. When energy costs spike, everything else follows. Food prices would surge. Shipping costs would explode. Manufacturing would struggle. And here's the kicker. The electric vehicle revolution is already threatening this system. As global oil demand potentially peaks and then declines over the next decade, the strategic importance of the petrodollar diminishes. Countries have less reason to hold massive dollar reserves if they're not buying as much oil. Beyond economics, the geopolitical consequences would be staggering. America's ability to project power globally is deeply tied to the dollar's dominance. Currently, the U.S. can impose sanctions that cripple entire countries by cutting them off from the dollar-based financial system. Iran, Russia, North Korea, all have felt this weapon. But if the dollar isn't essential for global trade, these sanctions lose their teeth. America's foreign policy leverage would diminish dramatically. Military spending would come under severe pressure. The Pentagon's budget is massive, but it's sustainable partly because the U.S. can borrow at low rates due to dollar dominance. Without that advantage, maintaining 800 military bases worldwide and numerous carrier groups becomes fiscally impossible. America would be forced to contract its global military presence. China would likely be the biggest beneficiary. The yuan still represents only about 2% of global reserves, but China is actively working to change this through initiatives like the Belt and Road, bilateral currency swap agreements, and the development of alternative payment systems. A dollar collapse would accelerate the shift toward a multipolar currency world, with China as a major pole. Regional powers like the EU, India, and possibly a unified BRICS bloc would gain influence. We might see the world fracture into currency zones, a dollar zone in the Americas, a euro zone in Europe, a yuan zone in Asia, rather than one dominant global currency. For average Americans, life would fundamentally change. The middle class would be hollowed out even further. Imported goods would become luxury items. Foreign travel would become prohibitively expensive. That trip to Europe or Asia that cost $3,000 might cost $10,000 or more. On the flip side, American manufacturing could see a renaissance. A weak dollar makes U.S. exports much more competitive globally. Made in America would become economically attractive again, not just a patriotic slogan. Manufacturing jobs could return as it becomes cheaper to produce goods domestically than to import them. However, this transition would be painful and take years. You can't rebuild industrial capacity overnight. In the meantime, Americans would face a severe decline in living standards. The era of cheap consumer goods from China would end abruptly. The federal government would face an impossible fiscal crisis. The national debt, currently over $36 trillion, would become much more expensive to service at higher interest rates. This would force dramatic cuts to government programs, Social Security, Medicare, defense spending, infrastructure, or the government would need to raise taxes substantially. Either way, Americans would feel the squeeze. Inflation would likely surge as the dollar weakens and import prices spike. The Federal Reserve would face a nightmare scenario: raise interest rates to fight inflation and potentially trigger a deep recession, or keep rates low and let inflation run rampant. This isn't unprecedented. The British pound sterling was the world's dominant reserve currency for over a century before World War II. When Britain's economy was devastated by 2 world wars, the pound lost this status to the dollar. The transition was painful for Britain. The country went from global superpower to a secondary power, experienced severe economic crises, and had to dramatically reduce its global footprint. But Britain didn't disappear. It adapted, refocused on its strengths, and remains a prosperous nation today. Just not the empire it once was. The dollar has actually experienced a major crisis before. From 1977 to 1991, the dollar's share of global reserves plunged from 85% to 46% as inflation exploded and confidence eroded. But by the 1990s, after inflation was controlled, central banks loaded up on dollar assets again. So recovery is possible. if the U.S. can maintain economic fundamentals. So how likely is this scenario? Most economists believe a sudden collapse is unlikely. The dollar still comprises 88% of all foreign exchange transactions. There's no obvious alternative that offers the same combination of liquidity, stability, and market depth. The euro has its own problems: political fragmentation, economic weakness in several member states. The Chinese yuan faces capital controls and lack of transparency. Gold can't facilitate the volume of transactions a modern economy requires. Cryptocurrencies remain too volatile and unproven. But a gradual decline? That's not just possible, it's already happening. If current trends continue, the dollar could fall below 50% of global reserves within the next decade. That wouldn't mean total collapse, but it would mean America loses many of its economic privileges. The real risks come from external shocks: a major war, a debt crisis, aggressive overuse of sanctions that pushes countries to find alternatives, or a breakthrough in digital currency technology that provides a viable alternative. Conclusion: the loss of reserve currency status wouldn't be an overnight apocalypse. It would be more like a slow-motion economic decline. America would gradually become poorer relative to the rest of the world. The easy credit would dry up. The cheap imports would disappear. The ability to finance massive deficits without consequence would end. Americans would have to work harder for less, save more, and accept a lower standard of living. The geopolitical dominance the U.S. has enjoyed since 1945 would wane. But the country wouldn't cease to exist or become a failed state. The question isn't whether this could happen. History shows reserve currencies do eventually fall. The question is whether it happens gradually over decades, allowing for adjustment, or rapidly in a crisis, causing maximum pain. Right now, in 2025, we're at a crossroads. The dollar's dominance is eroding, but it's not gone. What happens next depends on America's economic policies, geopolitical choices, and whether the rest of the world finds a viable alternative. One thing is certain: the era of unchallenged dollar supremacy is ending. Whether that ends in a crash or a controlled descent remains to be seen. What do you think? Could America adapt to a post-reserve currency world? Or would the economic and political shock be too severe? Let me know in the comments below.